The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he knew would be one of his final times. After 23 years of faithful service as a Queen's Guard, his retirement was just weeks away. The weight of tradition sat heavy on his shoulders, not from the ceremonial uniform he wore, but from the decades of memories that had shaped his career. Thomas had joined the Guard at 19, fresh-faced and eager to serve the crown. Back then, the idea of standing motionless for hours seemed like the greatest challenge he would face. How wrong he had been. Over the years, he had witnessed history unfold before his very eyes. He had stood guard during royal weddings, state funerals, and countless ceremonial occasions that marked the rhythm of Britain's constitutional monarchy. The palace grounds held a special kind of magic in the early morning hours. Before the tourists arrived with their cameras and excited chatter, there was a peaceful quality to the place that Thomas had grown to cherish. The ancient stones seemed to whisper stories of centuries past, and he felt honored to be part of that continuing narrative, even in his small way. As he made his way to his assigned post near the main entrance, Thomas reflected on how much had changed during his service. He had seen 3 generations of the royal family grow up before his eyes. He remembered when Prince William was just a young boy, full of energy and curiosity about the guards who protected his grandmother's home. Now William was a father himself, and his children were beginning to appear more frequently at palace events. The other guards respected Thomas deeply. He was known for his unwavering professionalism and his ability to mentor younger recruits. Many of the men currently serving had learned from him the art of maintaining perfect stillness while remaining alert to everything happening around them. It was a skill that took years to master, requiring both physical endurance and mental discipline. Thomas had always taken pride in the fact that he had never broken protocol during his entire career. Not once had he spoken while on duty, moved unnecessarily, or failed to maintain the stoic expression that was the hallmark of a Queen's Guard. Even when tourists tried their best to make him laugh or react, he remained as immutable as the palace walls themselves. His wife Sarah often joked that he brought his guard training home with him. She would tell their friends how Thomas could stand perfectly still while waiting for his morning tea to brew, or how he maintained impeccable posture even while watching television. Their 2 children, now grown and living their own lives, had inherited their father's sense of discipline and respect for tradition. The decision to retire had not been easy for Thomas. His body was beginning to show the wear of decades spent standing in all weather conditions. His knees ached on cold mornings and his back protested during the longer ceremonial duties. But more than the physical concerns, he worried about leaving behind the only career he had ever known. The Guard had given him purpose, identity, and a deep connection to something larger than himself. As visitors began to gather outside the palace gates, Thomas took his position with the same precision he had demonstrated thousands of times before. The familiar routine brought him comfort. He checked his weapon, adjusted his bearskin hat, and settled into the meditative state that would carry him through his duty hours. The crowd was typical for a weekend morning: families with young children, elderly couples on holiday, and the occasional history enthusiast who knew enough to appreciate the significance of the ceremony they were witnessing. Thomas had learned to read crowds over the years, to spot potential troublemakers or overly enthusiastic tourists who might try to test the Guard's resolve. Among the gathering spectators, he noticed a small group that seemed different from the usual visitors. They moved with a purpose and confidence that suggested they belonged here in a way that tourists did not. Palace staff, perhaps, or visiting dignitaries. Thomas filed the observation away but kept his expression neutral and his gaze fixed straight ahead. The morning proceeded according to routine. School groups passed by with their teachers explaining the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. Tourists took countless photographs, some posing dramatically beside the motionless sentries. Thomas had long ago stopped counting how many pictures included him as a backdrop to family memories. What he couldn't know was that this particular morning would become one of the most significant of his entire career. Hidden among the usual crowd of visitors was someone whose presence would soon change everything for the veteran Guard. A small gesture, barely noticeable to casual observers, was about to unfold that would touch not only Thomas's heart, but also capture the attention of people around the world. The palace staff had mentioned earlier that there might be some special visitors that day, but such announcements were common, and Thomas had learned not to attach too much significance to them. Royalty lived their lives according to schedules that could change without notice, and the guards were trained to be ready for anything while expecting nothing specific. As the sun climbed higher and the crowds grew thicker, Thomas maintained his vigilant watch. His trained eyes continued to scan for anything unusual while his body remained perfectly still. Years of experience had taught him to separate his conscious awareness into layers, part of him monitoring for security concerns, part maintaining the physical discipline of his post, and part simply appreciating the historic significance of his role. He thought briefly about his retirement ceremony, scheduled for the following month. There would be speeches and presentations, handshakes with officers he had served under, and probably a few tears from colleagues who had become like family over the years. But for now, he was still on duty, still serving with the same dedication that had defined his entire adult life. The morning was about to transform from routine to extraordinary, though Thomas had no way of knowing it yet. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life arrive without fanfare, disguised as ordinary circumstances that suddenly reveal their deeper significance. This was about to be one of those moments, and it would ensure that Thomas Mitchell's final weeks as a Queen's Guard would be remembered for something far more meaningful than just the end of a long career. The afternoon shift brought with it the usual increase in foot traffic as more tourists and locals made their way to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas had been at his post for nearly 3 hours, his body locked in the familiar stance that had become second nature after more than 2 decades of service. His eyes remained fixed forward, but his peripheral vision caught every movement in the bustling courtyard. It was then that he noticed the small entourage approaching from the direction of the palace's private entrance. The group moved with the careful choreography that always accompanied royal family members when they ventured into public spaces. Palace protection officers maintained a respectful but watchful distance, while staff members ensured that protocols were being followed. At the center of this carefully orchestrated movement was a figure that Thomas recognized immediately, though protocol prevented him from showing any sign of acknowledgement. Prince George, the young heir who had captured the public's heart since his birth, was making his way across the courtyard with the confident stride of a child who had grown up in these magnificent surroundings. The 10-year-old prince wore a simple navy jacket and gray trousers, his appearance deliberately understated to avoid drawing excessive attention from the crowd. His sandy hair caught the afternoon sunlight as he walked alongside one of his protection officers, occasionally pointing to various features of the palace architecture, with the natural curiosity of a bright child. Thomas had observed Prince George from a distance on several previous occasions, always maintaining the professional detachment required of his position. The young prince had grown considerably since Thomas first saw him as a toddler, transforming from a shy little boy who hid behind his parents' legs into a more confident child who seemed increasingly comfortable with his public role. What struck Thomas most about this particular encounter was how naturally Prince George moved through the space that would one day be his to command. There was no arrogance or presumption in his manner, just the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where he was. The prince acknowledged the tourists with polite nods when approached by palace staff for introductions, but he seemed most interested in observing the daily workings of his grandmother's household. The crowd began to take notice of the young royal's presence, though the protection officers were skilled at managing public interactions without creating a spectacle. Cameras appeared with increasing frequency, but the photographers maintained a respectful distance. There was something about Prince George's demeanor that seemed to encourage good behavior from the onlookers, a quality that would serve him well in his future role. As the prince's path brought him closer to Thomas's post, the veteran guard found himself wondering what thoughts occupied the mind of a child who had been born into such extraordinary circumstances. Did Prince George see the palace guards as protectors, as monuments to tradition, or simply as part of the familiar landscape of his unusual childhood? Thomas suspected it was probably a combination of all three, filtered through the perspective of someone still young enough to find wonder in everyday experiences. The protection officers were clearly experienced in managing such walkabouts, seamlessly guiding Prince George's movement while making the whole affair appear spontaneous and natural. They communicated through subtle gestures and positioning, creating a security perimeter that was both effective and unobtrusive. Thomas respected their professionalism and the delicate balance they maintained between safety and normalcy. Prince George's curiosity seemed particularly drawn to the architectural details of the palace facade. He paused frequently to examine carved stonework, ornate windows, and the various emblems that decorated the building. His questions to the accompanying staff member were spoken too quietly for Thomas to hear, but the animated gestures and pointing suggested a genuine interest in learning about his heritage. The young prince also appeared fascinated by the daily operations happening around him. Palace staff went about their duties with practiced efficiency, and Prince George watched their work with the keen attention of someone trying to understand how his world functioned. Thomas could see the boy's eyes following groundskeepers, security, personnel, and administrative staff as they moved through their routines. When a group of tourists recognized Prince George and began to gather at a respectful distance, the protection officers smoothly adjusted their positioning without making the security presence feel oppressive. The prince handled the attention with remarkable poise for his age, offering friendly waves and brief conversations when appropriate while never losing sight of his original purpose for being in the courtyard. Thomas found himself impressed by the young royal's natural instincts for public interaction. There was none of the awkwardness or reluctance that might be expected from a child thrust into such circumstances. Instead, Prince George seemed to understand intuitively that his presence brought joy to people, and he appeared genuinely pleased to provide that happiness through simple acknowledgement of their interest. The afternoon sun created dramatic shadows across the courtyard as Prince George's walkabout continued. The changing light transformed the familiar surroundings into something more theatrical, as if the palace itself was putting on a performance for its future king. Thomas had witnessed thousands of such scenes over his career, but there was something special about watching this particular child navigate his extraordinary inheritance with such apparent ease. As Prince George drew nearer to Thomas's position, the guard noticed the subtle ways in which the boy observed everything around him. His eyes missed nothing, not the positioning of security cameras, not the patterns of foot traffic, not the various uniforms worn by different categories of palace staff. It was the gaze of someone who was already learning to see his environment with the analytical eye that his future role would require. The protection officers remained alert but relaxed, their confidence in Prince George's ability to handle himself evident in their body language. They had clearly worked with the young prince before and had developed the kind of trust that comes only from experience and mutual respect. Thomas could see that they genuinely cared for the boy's well-being beyond their professional obligations. What Thomas couldn't anticipate was that his own decades of faithful service were about to intersect with Prince George's journey in a way that would create a moment of genuine human connection. The carefully maintained boundaries between royalty and those who served them were about to be crossed by a gesture so simple and sincere that it would remind everyone present why the monarchy had endured for centuries, not because of ceremony or protocol, but because of the human bonds that connected all the people within its orbit. The moment that would change everything began with such subtlety that most observers might have missed it entirely. Prince George's casual stroll through the courtyard had brought him to within 10 feet of Thomas's guard post when the young prince suddenly stopped walking. His protection officer paused as well, following the boy's gaze to understand what had captured his attention. Prince George was looking directly at Thomas, though the guard's training prevented him from returning the gaze or acknowledging the royal presence in any way. For nearly a minute, the future king simply stood there, studying the motionless figure in the iconic red tunic and towering bearskin hat. There was something in the boy's expression that suggested he was seeing the guard not as a tourist attraction or ceremonial fixture, but as a real person with his own story to tell. The protection officer noticed the prince's intense focus and moved closer, ready to gently redirect the walkabout if necessary. Palace protocol was clear about interactions between royalty and on-duty guards, and any deviation from established procedures required careful management. But something in Prince George's demeanor suggested that this was more than casual curiosity. Thomas could sense the attention focused on him, though he maintained his disciplined stillness. In his peripheral vision, he could see other tourists beginning to notice that Prince George had stopped to observe one of the guards. Cameras began to appear as people realized they might be witnessing something noteworthy, though none of them could have guessed what was about to unfold. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Prince George took a step closer to Thomas's position. The protection officer remained alert but didn't intervene, recognizing that the prince was operating within acceptable boundaries. The young royal's face showed deep concentration, as if he was working through some internal process that would guide his next actions. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as both completely unexpected and perfectly natural. Prince George raised his hand slowly and offered Thomas a crisp, formal salute. It wasn't the casual wave that royalty typically gave to crowds, nor was it the playful gesture of a child mimicking adult behavior. Instead, it was a precise, respectful military salute that demonstrated both the prince's understanding of protocol and his genuine respect for the man who had dedicated his life to royal service. The impact of that simple gesture rippled through the courtyard like a stone dropped into still water. Tourists who had been taking casual photographs suddenly realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The protection officers exchanged glances that reflected both surprise and admiration for the young prince's instinctive grasp of appropriate behavior. Palace staff members who happened to be nearby stopped their activities to observe the unprecedented moment. Thomas felt the gesture penetrate through decades of professional training and emotional control. His throat tightened with unexpected emotion as he processed what had just occurred. In 23 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever acknowledged him individually while he was on duty. The formal protocol that governed such interactions had always maintained clear boundaries between the monarchy and those who served it. Yet here was this 10-year-old boy, third in line to the throne, offering a salute that spoke of recognition, respect, and genuine appreciation. Prince George held the salute for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to convey sincerity, but not so long as to create an awkward moment for the guard who couldn't respond in kind. The young prince's face during those few seconds revealed a maturity that seemed beyond his years. There was no self-consciousness about the public nature of his gesture, no concern for the cameras that were now focused on him. Instead, there was simply a boy honoring a man whose service he had somehow come to understand and appreciate. When Prince George finally lowered his hand, he didn't immediately move away. Instead, he stood for another moment, making direct eye contact with Thomas in a way that conveyed a personal connection despite the formal circumstances. The guard's training prevented him from responding visibly, but something in his eyes must have communicated his profound gratitude, because the prince nodded slightly before continuing his walk. The protection officer fell back into step beside Prince George, though his expression suggested he was still processing what he had witnessed. In years of protecting members of the royal family, he had seen many public interactions, but this one felt different. There had been nothing calculated or performed about the prince's behavior. It had emerged from some genuine internal impulse that spoke well of the boy's character. The tourists who had witnessed the exchange began talking excitedly among themselves, many reviewing the photographs and videos they had captured. Social media posts would soon begin appearing, though none of the captions would adequately capture the emotional weight of what had transpired. The images would show a young prince saluting a guard, but they couldn't convey the profound human connection that had been forged in that moment. Other guards who had been positioned nearby had observed the entire interaction, though their own duty requirements prevented them from showing any reaction. Later during their break time, they would discuss what they had seen with a mixture of admiration for Prince George and happiness for their colleague who had been so honored. In the tight-knit community of palace guards, such recognition meant everything. Thomas continued his duty for the remainder of his shift, but the emotional impact of Prince George's gesture stayed with him throughout the afternoon. The simple act of acknowledgement had transformed what might have been just another routine day into something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. It was as if years of faithful service had suddenly been validated by someone who truly understood what that service meant. As the crowds continued to flow through the courtyard, several visitors approached other guards and asked if they had seen what Prince George had done. Word of the incident began to spread beyond the immediate witnesses, carried by people who recognized that they had observed something special. The story would soon reach palace administrators, senior guards, and eventually the media outlets that monitored royal activities. Prince George continued his walkabout for another 30 minutes, but his demeanor seemed different after the salute. He appeared more thoughtful, perhaps processing his own emotions about the gesture he had made. The protection officers noticed the change, but understood that such moments of personal growth were part of the prince's journey toward understanding his future role and responsibilities. Word of Prince George's spontaneous salute spread through the palace with remarkable speed. By evening, practically every staff member had heard some version of the story, though details varied depending on who was telling it. Some emphasized the precision of the prince's military bearing. Others focused on the emotional impact visible on Thomas's face, and many simply marveled at the young royal's instinctive understanding of respect and protocol. The palace's senior staff were particularly struck by the incident because it demonstrated qualities in Prince George that couldn't be taught or manufactured. Leadership experts often spoke about the importance of authentic connection between rulers and those they serve, but such connections usually developed over years of experience and careful cultivation. Here was a 10-year-old boy displaying that same instinct naturally, without prompting or coaching from adults. Thomas completed his shift in a state of emotional turbulence that was entirely new to his professional experience. When the relief guard arrived to take his position, Thomas moved through the standard transition protocol mechanically, his mind still processing what had occurred earlier. His colleague noticed something different in Thomas's demeanor, but respected the guard's need for silence while still on duty. It wasn't until Thomas had changed out of his ceremonial uniform and was walking to the staff parking area that he allowed himself to fully absorb the impact of Prince George's gesture. Standing beside his modest sedan, still wearing the plain clothes that marked him as just another palace employee heading home after work, Thomas felt tears beginning to form in his eyes for the first time in years. The drive home to his small house in Windsor gave Thomas time to reflect on the broader meaning of what had transpired. In a career defined by rigid protocol and emotional restraint, he had been touched by humanity in its purest form. Prince George's salute hadn't been about ceremony or tradition. It had been about one person recognizing the dignity and worth of another person's service. Sarah noticed the change in her husband immediately when he walked through their front door. After 40 years of marriage, she could read Thomas's moods better than he could himself. She saw past his attempts at casual conversation during dinner and recognized the profound impact of whatever had happened during his shift. When Thomas finally told her about Prince George's salute, Sarah's eyes filled with tears that matched her husband's. They sat together in their small living room that evening, Thomas recounting every detail he could remember about the encounter. Sarah asked gentle questions that helped him process the experience, understanding that her husband needed to work through emotions that his professional training had never prepared him to handle. They talked about the remarkable maturity Prince George had displayed and what it might mean for the future of the monarchy. Meanwhile, at Kensington Palace, Prince George was having his own conversation about the afternoon's events. His parents had been informed of the incident by the protection officer's report, and they wanted to understand their son's perspective on what had motivated his actions. Prince George explained with typical childhood directness that the guard had looked like someone who deserved recognition for his important work. The conversation with his parents revealed the thought process that had led to Prince George's decision to offer the salute. He had been observing the guards throughout his walkabout and had begun to wonder about their individual stories. When he focused on Thomas, something about the man's bearing and obvious dedication had prompted the prince to acknowledge him in the most respectful way he knew how. Prince William and Catherine exchanged meaningful glances during their son's explanation, recognizing that his instincts aligned perfectly with the values they had been trying to instill in him. They praised George for his thoughtfulness while also using the moment as a teaching opportunity about the responsibilities that came with his position and the power of simple gestures to create meaningful connections. The story might have remained a private moment shared among palace staff if not for the dozens of tourists who had captured the salute on their cameras and phones. By the next morning, social media platforms were buzzing with videos and photographs of the young prince's gesture, accompanied by captions that ranged from heartwarming to historically significant. News outlets picked up the story quickly, recognizing both its human interest appeal and its broader implications for the royal family's public image. Royal correspondents who had covered the monarchy for decades described the incident as unprecedented in their experience, noting that such spontaneous displays of respect between royalty and palace staff typically occurred only in private settings. The response from the public was overwhelmingly positive, with thousands of comments and shares expressing admiration for Prince George's maturity and respect for service members. Veterans organizations issued statements praising the young prince for understanding the importance of acknowledging those who serve, while military families shared their own stories of meaningful gestures that had touched their lives. Thomas found himself at the center of media attention for the first time in his career, though palace policy protected him from direct contact with journalists. Reporters who called the palace seeking interviews were politely referred to official spokespeople who confirmed the basic facts of the incident while respecting Thomas's privacy. The guard appreciated the protection, but also felt a strange sense of pride that his years of faithful service had finally been recognized publicly. His fellow guards treated Thomas with a mixture of admiration and gentle teasing when he returned to work the next day. Some joked that he had become the most famous Queen's Guard in history, while others expressed genuine happiness that one of their own had been honored in such a meaningful way. The camaraderie among the guards had always been strong, but the shared pride in Thomas's recognition brought them even closer together. Palace administrators faced the unusual challenge of managing public interest in what was essentially a private moment between a young royal and a faithful employee. They decided to embrace the positive nature of the story while maintaining appropriate boundaries around both Prince George's privacy and Thomas's personal life. Official statements acknowledged the incident while emphasizing the respect for service that the gesture represented. The incident also prompted discussions among royal protocol experts about the evolving nature of monarchy in the modern age. Some traditionalists worried about deviation from established procedures, while others saw Prince George's spontaneous gesture as evidence of the royal family's ability to adapt to contemporary expectations while maintaining core values of respect and service. As the story continued to spread through news outlets and social media platforms, it became clear that Prince George's simple salute had touched something deep in the public consciousness. In an age often characterized by cynicism and division, here was a moment of pure human connection that reminded people of the basic dignity that all individuals deserved, regardless of their position in society. The story of Prince George's salute had taken on a life of its own by the end of the week, reaching far beyond the usual circles of royal watchers and palace enthusiasts. International news organizations picked up the story, recognizing its appeal to global audiences hungry for positive news about respect, tradition, and human dignity. The simple gesture had somehow captured the imagination of people from vastly different cultures and backgrounds. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of being recognized by strangers during his off-duty hours. While shopping with Sarah at their local supermarket, an elderly gentleman approached him with tears in his eyes, thanking him for his service and expressing how moved he had been by the video of Prince George's salute. Similar encounters occurred throughout the week, each one reminding Thomas of how widely his story had spread. The palace's social media team, typically cautious about highlighting individual staff members, made an exception in this case by sharing some of the most positive public responses to the incident. They carefully curated posts that celebrated both Prince George's character and the broader principle of recognizing faithful service, while avoiding anything that might compromise Thomas's privacy or create unrealistic expectations for future royal interactions. Letters began arriving at the palace from veterans, active military personnel and their families, all expressing gratitude for Prince George's gesture and sharing their own stories of meaningful recognition. Many writers noted how the prince's spontaneous salute had reminded them of their own experiences with unexpected acknowledgement of their service, creating a sense of shared understanding across generations and circumstances. Educational institutions seized upon the story as a teaching opportunity, with primary schools using it to discuss themes of respect, service, and the importance of acknowledging others' contributions to society. Teachers reported that their students were particularly engaged when discussing how someone as young as Prince George could demonstrate such mature understanding of these concepts. The impact extended to military academies and training institutions, where instructors used the incident to illustrate principles of leadership and the power of simple gestures to build morale and connection. The precision of Prince George's salute was analyzed and praised by military professionals, who recognized the respect and attention to detail that the gesture had demonstrated. Thomas's own family experienced the ripple effects of their father's sudden fame in unexpected ways. His adult children, who had always been proud of their father's career but had rarely discussed it publicly, found themselves fielding questions from colleagues and friends who had seen the story in news reports. They discovered a new appreciation for the significance of their father's work and the respect it commanded from others. The incident also sparked discussions within the royal household about the role of spontaneous gestures in building public connection and support. Royal advisors, who typically focused on carefully planned public appearances, found themselves studying the organic impact of Prince George's unscripted moment, recognizing that authentic displays of character often resonated more deeply than formal ceremonies. Prince George himself seemed largely unaffected by the attention his gesture had generated, though his parents noted his increased interest in learning about the various people who worked at the palace. He began asking more questions about the roles and backgrounds of staff members he encountered, demonstrating a growing understanding of the complex community that supported royal operations. The young prince's curiosity led to informal introductions with several longtime palace employees, always arranged carefully to respect protocol while allowing meaningful interaction. These encounters revealed Prince George's genuine interest in understanding how different people contributed to the functioning of his family's household, a perspective that would serve him well in his future role. Thomas's retirement date was fast approaching, and palace officials began planning a ceremony that would appropriately honor his decades of faithful service while acknowledging the special circumstances that had brought his story to public attention. The challenge was creating an event that felt authentic and respectful rather than opportunistic or designed primarily for media consumption. The planning process involved careful consultation with Thomas and his family to ensure that any recognition aligned with their values and comfort level. The guard had spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight, and palace officials were determined not to force him into unwanted attention simply because circumstances had made him temporarily famous. Military colleagues from Thomas's earlier service reached out to reconnect, having seen his story in the news and wanting to congratulate him on the recognition he had received. These conversations reminded Thomas of his journey from young soldier to palace guard, helping him process the full arc of his career in service to crown and country. The broader impact of Prince George's gesture became evident in the small but meaningful changes it inspired in others. Security personnel at various institutions reported increased expressions of appreciation from the public, while teachers noted that students seemed more aware of the importance of acknowledging the contributions of school support, staff and maintenance workers, veterans. Organizations experienced a surge in volunteer applications from young people who had been inspired by the story to find their own ways of showing appreciation for military service. Youth groups organized visits to veterans' hospitals and care facilities, often referencing Prince George's example as motivation for their outreach efforts. The story's global reach became apparent when international media outlets began featuring similar stories of young people showing respect for service members in their own countries. Prince George's gesture had somehow become a catalyst for broader recognition of the value of acknowledging those who serve in various capacities around the world. Palace historians noted that while spontaneous gestures of respect between royalty and staff had occurred throughout history, very few had been captured on camera and shared so widely. The incident would likely become part of the historical record of Prince George's development as a future monarch, marking an early demonstration of the character traits that would define his approach to royal duty. As Thomas prepared for his final weeks of service, he found himself reflecting not just on his own career, but on the broader meaning of the recognition he had received. Prince George's salute had transformed what might have been a quiet conclusion to his military service into something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, ensuring that his dedication would be part of a larger story about respect, tradition, and human connection. As Thomas's final week of service approached, the palace faced an unprecedented situation in planning his retirement ceremony. Typically, guard retirements were intimate affairs attended by immediate colleagues and direct supervisors, marked by formal presentations and handshakes that honored faithful service without fanfare. However, Prince George's gesture had transformed Thomas from an anonymous guardian into a symbol of dedication that had captured international attention. Palace protocol officers worked carefully to design a ceremony that would appropriately honor Thomas's service while respecting the dignity that had defined his career. They wanted to acknowledge the special circumstances that had brought his story to public attention without allowing the event to become a media spectacle that would overshadow the genuine appreciation being expressed. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Thomas would receive his standard retirement honors in the traditional location, attended by his family and colleagues as originally planned. However, there would be one significant addition to the usual protocol. Prince George had requested permission to attend the ceremony and personally thanked Thomas for his years of faithful service. When Thomas learned of Prince George's intended participation, he was overwhelmed by the honor being shown to him. In his 23 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever attended a guard's retirement ceremony. The young prince's request demonstrated a level of personal respect that went far beyond the spontaneous salute that had started everything. The news of Prince George's planned attendance was kept strictly confidential to prevent media interference with what was intended to be a private moment of appreciation. Only Thomas's immediate family and closest colleagues were informed, ensuring that the ceremony would maintain its intimate character while acknowledging the special significance of the prince's participation. Sarah helped Thomas select his civilian clothes for the ceremony, understanding that this transition from military uniform to ordinary dress represented more than just a change of career. It marked the end of an identity that had defined her husband for more than 2 decades. They chose his best suit, the one he had worn to their children's graduations and other significant family events. The morning of the ceremony, Thomas awoke with a mixture of emotions that he struggled to categorize. Pride in his service competed with sadness about leaving, while anticipation of Prince George's attendance added an element of nervous excitement that was entirely new to his professional experience. He had faced armed intruders, weathered torrential storms, and stood guard during national crises, but the prospect of a personal conversation with royalty left him surprisingly anxious. His fellow guards had planned their own tribute to Thomas, organizing a small presentation that would occur before the formal ceremony. They gathered in the guardroom that had been Thomas's second home for over 2 decades, sharing stories and memories that highlighted both his professional excellence and his role as mentor to younger colleagues. The gifts they presented were simple but meaningful: a framed photograph of the guard room, signed by every current member of the unit, a book documenting the history of the Queen's Guard, with a personal inscription acknowledging Thomas's contribution to that history, and a ceremonial sword that had belonged to a previous guard commander who had served with similar distinction. When the formal ceremony began, Thomas was struck by how different the familiar parade ground looked when filled with people celebrating his service rather than witnessing routine protocol. His adult children sat with Sarah in the front row, their faces reflecting the same mixture of pride and emotion that Thomas felt, but could barely express. The commanding officer's speech reviewing Thomas's career achievements felt surreal to the retiring guard, who had never considered his faithful performance of duty to be particularly noteworthy. Hearing his service described in formal language that emphasized its significance to the institution and the crown helped Thomas understand why Prince George's recognition had resonated so powerfully with others. When Prince George arrived for his part of the ceremony, he was accompanied only by a single protection officer and dressed in a simple dark suit that emphasized the personal rather than official nature of his attendance. The young prince's demeanor was appropriately serious for the occasion, but Thomas could see the genuine warmth in his expression as he approached. The conversation between Prince George and Thomas, though brief, carried emotional weight that was evident to everyone present. The prince thanked Thomas personally for his years of faithful service, expressing appreciation not just for his professional duties, but for the example he had set for others. Thomas, finally able to respond directly to royalty after decades of silent service, expressed his gratitude for the honor of serving and his appreciation for the prince's recognition. What made the moment particularly special was Prince George's ability to connect with Thomas as one person acknowledging another, despite the vast differences in their circumstances. The prince asked about Thomas's plans for retirement and expressed genuine interest in the guard's perspective on his years of palace service. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it created a human connection that transcended protocol and hierarchy. When Prince George presented Thomas with a personally signed photograph commemorating his service, the emotional impact was visible on the faces of everyone present. The image showed the prince offering his famous salute, with a handwritten message expressing gratitude for Thomas's dedication and best wishes for his retirement. It was a gift that transformed a spontaneous moment into a permanent reminder of mutual respect. The ceremony concluded with the traditional folding of Thomas's service flag and the presentation of his official retirement documents. As he shook hands with his commanding officer for the final time as an active guard, Thomas realized that Prince George's gesture weeks earlier had given deeper meaning to this moment of transition. Instead of simply marking the end of his career, the ceremony celebrated the value of faithful service and its recognition by those it protected. As guests began to disperse after the formal proceedings, Prince George lingered to speak briefly with Sarah and Thomas's children, thanking them for sharing their husband and father with the crown for so many years. His acknowledgement of their sacrifice demonstrated the same thoughtfulness that had prompted his original salute, showing an understanding of service that extended beyond the individual to encompass the families who supported it. The young prince's final gesture was to ask Thomas for his own salute in return, a request that brought the story full circle. As Thomas offered his crispest military salute to the future king, both participants understood they were creating a moment that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The image of mutual respect between a retiring guard and a young prince captured everything that was best about the relationship between those who serve and those they protect. The weeks following Thomas's retirement ceremony brought an unexpected period of adjustment as he learned to navigate life outside the structured world of royal service. The transition from a career defined by rigid schedules and formal protocols to the freedom of civilian life proved more challenging than he had anticipated. Despite years of mental preparation for this change, Sarah watched her husband carefully during those first days, recognizing signs of the restlessness that often affected military personnel when they left active service. Thomas would wake automatically at 5 in the morning, his internal clock still set to guard duty schedules, and would often find himself standing straighter than necessary while performing simple household tasks. The habits of 2 decades couldn't be abandoned overnight. The signed photograph from Prince George held a place of honor on their living room mantelpiece, becoming a conversation starter whenever friends or neighbors visited. Thomas found himself telling and retelling the story of that memorable afternoon, each recounting helping him process the significance of what had occurred and its impact on his understanding of his own service. Letters continued to arrive from around the world, forwarded through palace channels from people who had been touched by the story of Prince George's gesture. Veterans shared their own experiences of meaningful recognition. Parents wrote about teaching their children the importance of respecting service members, and young people expressed their intention to follow Prince George's example by acknowledging those who served in their own communities. One letter particularly moved Thomas. It came from a young soldier stationed overseas who wrote that the story had inspired him to continue his own service with renewed pride and purpose. The soldier explained that seeing a future king recognize the dignity of a guard's work had helped him understand the broader significance of his own duties. Even in moments when they seemed routine or thankless, Thomas decided to frame this letter alongside Prince George's photograph, creating a small display that represented both the personal honor he had received and the wider impact that the prince's gesture had achieved. The combination served as a daily reminder that individual acts of respect could create ripples of inspiration that reached far beyond their original scope. The media attention surrounding Thomas's story had largely subsided, but the palace communications team occasionally shared updates about the continued positive response to Prince George's gesture. Educational institutions were still using the incident as a teaching tool, and several charitable organizations had reported increased interest in programs supporting military families and veterans. Prince George himself had returned to his usual routines of education and family time, But palace staff noted that he continued to show increased awareness of and appreciation for the people who worked around him. His spontaneous gesture had apparently strengthened his own understanding of the importance of acknowledging service, creating a positive feedback loop that would likely influence his future interactions throughout his life. As autumn arrived, Thomas found his rhythm in retirement through volunteer work with local veterans organizations. His experience and patient demeanor made him a natural mentor for younger former service members who were struggling with their own transitions to civilian life. He discovered that sharing his story often helped others process their own experiences of service and recognition. During one particularly meaningful conversation with a recently discharged soldier who was struggling with the feeling that his service had been unappreciated, Thomas shared Prince George's signed photograph and explained how a simple gesture had transformed his own perspective on the value of faithful duty. The young veteran left their meeting with tears in his eyes and a renewed sense of the dignity inherent in military service. The local community gradually embraced Thomas as something of a celebrity, though he remained characteristically modest about the attention. The pub where he occasionally met friends for lunch displayed a framed newspaper clipping about Prince George's salute, and the staff always insisted that Thomas's meals were on the house. He accepted such gestures graciously while maintaining the same quiet dignity that had defined his guard service. Sarah noticed that retirement had given her husband a new appreciation for the impact his career had made, not just on his own family but on the broader institution he had served. Conversations with former colleagues who stopped by for visits revealed how many younger guards had looked to Thomas as an example of professionalism and dedication, influence he had never fully recognized while actively serving. The anniversary of Prince George's famous salute arrived with surprisingly little fanfare, though palace social media accounts shared a brief remembrance of the moment, along with renewed appreciation for all those who serve in various capacities. Thomas spent that day reflecting on how a single afternoon had transformed from routine duty into a defining moment of his career. As winter approached, Thomas received an unexpected invitation to attend the palace's annual staff appreciation ceremony, a formal event recognizing employees who had demonstrated exceptional service throughout the year. While he was no longer an active staff member, palace officials wanted to include him as a representative of the many guards who had served faithfully over the decades. The ceremony provided Thomas with an opportunity to reunite with former colleagues and meet current staff members who had heard his story. Many approached him to express their own gratitude for the positive attention his experience had brought to palace service roles that often went unrecognized by the general public. During the reception, following the formal presentations, Thomas was approached by a young guard who had recently joined the unit. The new recruit explained that Prince George's gesture had inspired him to pursue royal service, seeing it as an opportunity to be part of something larger than himself while knowing that his dedication would be appreciated by those he protected. This conversation helped Thomas understand that his story had become part of the legacy passed down to future guards, a reminder that their service mattered, and that simple acts of recognition could create lasting bonds between those who serve and those they protect. Prince George's spontaneous salute had evolved into a continuing source of inspiration for new generations of palace staff. As Thomas drove home from the ceremony that evening, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a young prince's moment of recognition and had led to this celebration of service and appreciation. The simple gesture had reminded him that faithfulness, dignity, and mutual respect remained the foundation of meaningful human connection. Regardless of differences in position or circumstance, the story of Prince George's salute had become part of palace folklore, a reminder that the most powerful moments often arise spontaneously from genuine human impulses rather than carefully planned protocols. For Thomas, it had transformed his retirement from a quiet conclusion to his career into a celebration of service that would inspire others for years to come. The silent gesture from a young prince had spoken volumes about character, respect, and the enduring value of acknowledging those who dedicate their lives to serving something greater than themselves.